Friends, we are here with our third part of our ethical decision making chapter, or how we are improving our ethical skills navigating ethical situations. It's the third part, as I just said, and the topic for this part is to be able to explain the models that we use for ethical decision making. So this little video will hold 4 different models. So, why are we looking at ethical decision-making models? Well, to understand ethical decision models will obviously help us. It helps us in developing our self-management as well as our relationship management skills. So these are actual tools, right? So if we have decision-making models that help us navigate ethical situations that are potentially gray areas that are harder, having these decision-making tools help us make good decisions, or better decisions maybe. And even though there are literally like hundreds of models out there, we are covering 4. And as the chapter notes, most of the models out there in this universe are like the ones we will cover here. And so what you will see is very quickly is that every model essentially have some steps, and you go through the steps and you ask questions along the way. And so it's essentially a process. And if you go through that process fully, then you will end up with a decision that is maybe better than the one you had, or the choice that is better than the one you had prior to starting that decision model. They are also noting that ethical decisions tend to be super quick. And they're running through an example in your textbook, and it's also on some of your slides here, which is if you're in a grocery store or in a retail store and you're buying something and you're not using your credit card or PayPal or Apple Pay, but you're actually using cash, which is interesting. In Sweden, it's basically the most cash, where I'm from, is the most cashless society in the world. There is no cash in any place in Sweden, and I know other places on the globe are very different from that. So you're in a grocery store, retail store in Sweden or United States or in Thailand, and you're given too much change. What do you do about it, right? So it's a very quick, you only have a few seconds to correct the situation. And so in these quick ethical gray zone situations, our values and morals come into play really quickly. And so those are sort of gut decisions, because these decisions happen very fast. So the 4 models that we will be looking at are the Philosophers approach, the 12 questions model, the Josephson model from the Josephson Institute, and also what's called the steps to ethical decision making model. Neither model is the model. There's no perfect model, obviously. So the suggestion here is really to combine the models and look at them holistically and take bits and pieces that work. And that might be the best way for us to make decisions. So the first of our ethical decision-making models is the 12 questions models. And this was originated by Laura Nash, who's an ethics researcher. And she created the 12 questions model as a super simple approach that will make it easier for people to make ethical decisions. And she said, here are 12 questions that you should be asking yourselves that help reframe our perspective, help us think differently on the choice that we are about to make. And so it helps us look at these ethical choices from all different angles. So the 12 questions are: 1, have you defined the problem accurately, right? Problem statement, did you write it out? Is it accurate? 2, how would you define the problem if you stood on the other side of the fence? If you're somebody else, maybe somebody who's disagreeing with you, how would they define the problem? 3, how did this situation occur? How did it come about in the first place? So describe. 4, who are you loyal to? To whom and to what in your organization do you give your loyalty to? That might create biases. 5, What is your intention in making this decision? Intention. 6, how does this intention compare with the likely results, right? So we can separate intent from impact, intention from impact. So results. 7, whom could your decision or action injure, right? So who is affected negatively by your decision or by your action? 8, can you engage the affected parties? So if there are other people, other units that would be impacted, can you talk to them before you make a decision? 9, are you confident that your position will be valid over a long period of time as it is now? What would make it change? 10, could you disclose without any qualms your decision or action to your boss, family, or society as a whole? Could you broadcast your decision? This is the newspaper test. 11, what is the symbolic potential of your action if understood, right? What are your actions saying symbolically? Or if they were to be misunderstood, how are people interpreting your action or your decision? Finally, number 12, under what conditions would you allow exceptions to your decision or to your stand? That is the 12 questions model. The next question in our ethical decision-making models is from the Josephson's Institute of Ethics, and they use 6 different steps in their ethical decision-making model. The first one is stop and think. The second one is clarify goals. The third one is determine facts. What are the base facts? Number 4 is to develop options. Number 5 is to consider consequences. And lastly, number 6 is to choose and then to monitor and modify. And we'll talk about them on the next slide. So, for the first one, to stop and think. When we stop to think, this avoids rash decisions. We pause and we reflect, right? This allows us to focus on what we need to do, on the right decision-making process. It also helps us determine if the situation is legal or ethical. So just pausing instead of just subconsciously deciding will help us. Number 2, when we clarify our goals, we focus on expected and desired outcomes. So we need to know what the goal is. So clarifying it, writing it down, will help us focus on what we want to happen. Number 3 is that we need to determine the facts in the situation. Where are we getting our facts? Is the person who is providing facts to us credible, right? Is the source credible? Could there be biases or assumptions? What are the facts? And then checking to make sure the facts are credible. Number 4 is to create all those options on a list, right? So a list of options. Brainstorming over a period of time is probably the best way to do that. Make sure we get all the possible solutions we possibly can on that list. Number 5, we look at the consequences of the actions. So we look at the options and then what happens when we choose them, right? So what are the consequences or the possible consequences of our actions? Who will be helped? Who will be hurt? How will we feel? What will the outcome mean for future decision makings, etc. And finally, you pick a choice and then you monitor it and then you modify, right? So that's the feedback loop. You choose something, you see what happens, and then you fix it if you need to. This is an example of the Johnson's model, and it runs through an example of whether or not it would be ethical, right, to download music from share sites. And so if you're interested in reading this, I'm not going to talk about it. It's from your textbook, but you can pause the video and look through it. All right, that brings us to the ethical decision-making steps. So as we already know at this point, the ethical decision-making process that we've seen include different number of steps. And one such model, one additional model, was created in the 1990s for the counseling professions, for those who are counselors and those who counsel people in need. But what we've learned is that this model can also apply to almost every profession. It doesn't matter if you're in business or in health or in industry, it doesn't matter. So the authors here give us 8 steps for the process, and it's very similar to the Josephson's model, couple of variations. Step number 1 is to identify the problem. Sometimes just realizing that a particular situation is ethical is an important first step, especially in organization if we just routinely or automatically do it just because this is the way we do things around here and we don't even question whether it is. So first, identify the problem. Is it an ethical situation? Step 2, identify the potential issues involved, right? Identify the potential issues involved. Who can get hurt? What are the issues that could negatively impact people, the company, the community, the stakeholders? What happens if we don't do anything? What happens if we do A or B? Step number 3, review relevant ethical guidelines. Does the organization have policies, procedures in place that you can refer back to? They can help you handle the situation. For instance, if a client gives you a gift, there's probably a rule in place on whether you can accept it, and if you can accept it, what the dollar amount or the money, the money amount on that is. Step number 4, know all relevant laws and regulations. If the company doesn't necessarily have a rule or a policy, it could still be illegal. So making sure that we know the legislative framework, the laws and the regulations. Step number 5 is to talk to people. Seek consultation. Talk to supervisors, coworkers, people that you trust and that you know are moral and ethical. Step number 6, consider possible and probable courses of action. What are all the possible solutions for solving the problem? Brainstorm a list of solutions. All of the solutions are options during this phase, even though you don't think that they will be useful. But at this point, we're putting everything on paper. Number 7, list the consequences of the probable causes of actions. What are both the positive and negative benefits of each proposed solution, and who can the decision impact? Step number 8, decide on what appears to be the best course of action. With the facts in hand and the analysis complete, choose the best course of action, right? So again, we are picking what will happen and we are looking to see whether that will be the best solution. And then we're moving forward and then we are trying to fix what needs to be fixed in this solution that seems to create the most good and the least harm. And that actually leads us to the philosopher's approach, lastly. So philosophers and ethicists believe in a few ethical standards, and they believe that these ethical standards can help us guide ethical decision making. And these standards include utilitarian, rights approach, common good, and virtue approach. So the utilitarian approach says that when you're picking what to do, when you're choosing one ethical action over another one, you should pick the one that does the most good and the least harm. So for instance, we are going back to the grocery store or the retail store example, and they give you too much change when you are paying. And then you would ask yourself, if I keep the change, what's the harm? Or if I keep it, would there be any good coming from that, right? Perhaps the good that is coming from that is that I can now pay back my friend who I owe money. But the harm could be that the cashier could lose their job. So this approach, the utilitarian approach, sees that there is some good and some harm, mostly in every situation. And how do we balance those? The second one is the rights approach. This one says that we look at how our actions affect the rights of the people around us. So we look at the people around us, the individuals around us, and their rights to make decisions. So for instance, coming back to the grocery store, we might consider the rights of the corporation. We might consider the rights of the cashier, the right of me personally, right, to keep the change if it was given to me. So what are our rights in this situation? And the common good approach says that when we make ethical decisions, we should benefit the community. For the common good, we should benefit. So if we accept extra change, we would give it to somebody else. We would donate it to a local park cleanup, to any sort of non-profit, and we would now say that's okay because we are focused on bettering the community. And then the virtue approach lastly says, what are the desirable qualities we want to have as a human? And we should act to obtain our highest potential. So for instance, excuse me, I have a little bit of an allergy going on today. We would ask the question, what kind of a person will I be if I do this, right? So if I'm in the grocery store, I get too much money back, and if I keep it, what kind of a person am I, right? So these are the desirable qualities we want to have. And you might want to say, well, I want to be an honest and ethical person. So if I accept the change, I am no longer that person. And so I don't want to do that. And here is Robin Hood, right? So the common good approach that we talked about on the prior slide is like the Robin Hood approach. You steal from the rich, you give to the poor, because that is better from the common good. That was the theme of the Robin Hood approach. So my question to you is, what do you think are the challenges or the downsides of the common good approach, as well as the utilitarian, the virtue, and the rights approach? So what are the common pros and cons of each of these four approaches? Of course, there are challenges with the philosophers' approaches. Firstly, we can't agree. We can't agree as humans on what is good, what is harmful. We don't agree on what are the human rights that people should have. We don't agree on what common good means, right? And because of this, like with the definition of ethics, it's challenging. And so we might have to combine several approaches when we are making these decisions. And if we do that, we might be more likely to make better ethical decisions, which helps us obviously with our self-management and our relationship management, which is what we are working on in this course. So we want to make sure that we don't cherry pick, we don't pick and choose the questions or the steps that will give us the outcome that we want, but rather we want to pick more broadly, choose more broadly and more holistically, so that we actually get the most ethical the most ethical decision in that situation possible. So for exercises here, right? Think of a recent ethical decision that you have made using one or more of the models we just talked about. Think through how you went through that process of making the decision. Did it make sense? Did you follow one of the processes? What could you have done better? And then, as I already talked about, right, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the philosophers' approaches, as well as the other models that we talked about? How can you combine these to make better ethical decisions? So in summary, we can use a variety of models to help us make better ethical decisions. We have the 12 questions model, which encourages us to ask questions such as who this impacts to determine the best ethical choices. That's a difficult word for me. I always mispronounce affects. Then we have the Josephson's model that has the 6 steps. And then you have the steps model that is just called the steps model. And then lastly, we looked at the philosophers' approaches with utilitarian, common good, rights, and virtue approach. That will wrap it for today. I'll see you next time. Bye.